Mike was never the kind of guy who caused trouble. Quiet electrician in his early 30s, kept his head down, showed up to work on time, paid his bills. When his uncle passed away and left him a small lake cabin in the Oregon woods, everyone who knew Mike figured it was well deserved. He was the only family member who still visited the old man after the dementia got bad. He was the one who sat through long afternoons in the nursing home, listening to the same stories repeated 3 times in an hour. But what none of them could have predicted was the firestorm that cabin would ignite. One phone call from a county sheriff would turn Mike's quiet life upside down and force him into a battle he never asked for against someone he once called family. The kind of battle that leaves permanent scars, even after you win. And Mike would learn that sometimes the people who smile at you at Thanksgiving are the same ones who will stab you in the back as soon as there is something worth taking.
I got the call on a Tuesday afternoon while I was running conduit in a new office building out in Beaverton. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I almost ignored it because my hands were full of EMT tubing and my head was buried in a ceiling joist. But something made me stop. Call it instinct. I pulled out my phone and saw the number was from the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. My first thought was that something had happened to my mom. She lived alone in the old house out in Sandy, and I always worried about her falling off the roof or forgetting to take her medication. But the deputy on the other end of the line told me something I was not prepared for. He said there had been a complaint about a break-in at my uncle's cabin on Timothy Lake. I told him that could not be right because the cabin had been locked up tight since the funeral 2 months ago. I had the only set of keys. I had personally walked through every room, turned off the water, and made sure everything was secure before I drove back to Portland. The deputy said there was a woman on the property claiming she was the new owner. She had changed the locks. I felt my stomach drop into my boots. I told my foreman I had an emergency and drove the 90 minutes east toward the mountains with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The whole way there, I ran through every possible explanation. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe someone had broken in and was pretending to be the owner. Maybe the deputy had misunderstood the situation. Any explanation was better than the one I was about to receive. When I pulled up to the cabin, I saw a silver SUV parked in the gravel drive next to a sheriff's cruiser. The cabin looked exactly the same as it always had: weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged slightly on the left side, where Uncle Roy always said he was going to fix it but never got around to it. The only difference was the new deadbolt on the front door, shiny brass against the old wood. Standing on the porch was my cousin Karen, her husband Gary, and a deputy who looked like he wished he was anywhere else. Karen smiled at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. "Mike," she said in that sweet voice she always used when she was about to screw someone over, "I am so glad you came. We need to talk about the cabin." I said I thought we had already talked about the cabin. At the reading of the will, when the lawyer made it clear that Uncle Roy had left the property to me, Karen had sat in silence with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She had not said a word then, but apparently she had been saving up her words for later. She explained that Uncle Roy had promised her the cabin years ago, before the dementia got bad. She said they had a conversation at a family barbecue in 2019 where he told her she could have the lake property after he was gone. She did not have it in writing, of course, but she said it was a verbal agreement, and that counted for something. I asked her why she had not mentioned this at the reading of the will. She said she did not want to cause a scene. I asked her why she thought changing the locks on a property that did not belong to her was acceptable. She said she was securing her inheritance. Gary stood behind her with his arms crossed, saying nothing, just letting his wife do the talking. He was a big guy, former military, worked as a security guard at a casino. He had that look guys get when they are used to intimidating people without saying a word. The deputy asked if I had documentation proving ownership. I pulled up the will on my phone, the copy the lawyer had emailed me. He looked at it, looked at Karen, and told her this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. If she wanted to contest the will, she needed to go through probate court. In the meantime, she needed to vacate the property. Karen laughed. It was not a nice laugh. She told the deputy she was not going anywhere. She had already paid a locksmith to change the locks, had moved in a couch and a bed and some kitchen supplies, and had enrolled her youngest kid in the local school district. She was planted. The deputy said he could not force her to leave without a court order. He recommended I contact a lawyer and file an eviction notice. I stood there on the gravel driveway, staring at my uncle's cabin with its shiny new deadbolt, and realized I was about to enter a legal nightmare that could drag on for months. Gary finally spoke. He said, "Why do not you just let it go, Mike? You live in Portland. You have a job. You do not need this place. Karen has been through a lot. She needs a fresh start." I asked what kind of fresh start required stealing someone else's property. Karen's face went cold. She said Uncle Roy loved me more than he loved you. He visited me every Christmas. He came to my kids' birthdays. He was at my wedding. Where were you? Working some construction job in the rain? You did not care about him until he had something you wanted. That stung because there was a sliver of truth in it. I had not visited as often as I should have after I moved to Portland, but I had been there at the end. I had been the one holding his hand in the hospice room, while Karen was posting vacation photos in Cancun. I had been the one who made sure his bills got paid when he could not remember to do it himself. I had been the one who cleaned out his house after he passed, finding old photographs and letters and military medals tucked away in shoeboxes. I told Karen I would see her in court. She said she would be waiting. I drove away from the cabin that day with my knuckles white on the steering wheel and a memory burning in my chest. I remembered the summer I turned 16, when Uncle Roy taught me how to replace the rotted boards on that same porch. We had spent 3 days together measuring and cutting and nailing while the lake lapped against the dock. He had told me stories about my father when they were boys, stories my dad never talked about. He had told me the cabin would be mine someday, if I wanted it, because I was the only one who seemed to understand what it meant to take care of something that was not yours. I had not thought about that conversation in years. But Karen's face, smug and certain on that porch, brought it all rushing back. Karen and I had been close once. When we were kids, we spent every summer at Uncle Roy's cabin together, swimming in the lake and catching frogs in mason jars. But somewhere along the way, we became different people. She married Gary and moved to the suburbs and started caring about things like square footage and property values. I stayed in the trades and kept my life small and simple. The last time we had a real conversation was at my grandmother's funeral 6 years ago. After that, we were just people who shared a last name. The drive back to Portland was the longest 90 minutes of my life. I called my lawyer as soon as I got home. He specialized in real estate law and had handled my uncle's will, so he already knew the situation. I explained what had happened, and he sighed in that way lawyers do when they know they are about to bill a lot of hours. He said the first step was to file an eviction notice. Since Karen was not a tenant and had never paid rent, the process was called an ejectment action. It would take time. It would take money. And there was a chance Karen could file a counterclaim based on the alleged verbal agreement, which would drag things out even longer. I asked how long. He said anywhere from 3 to 6 months, maybe longer if she fought it. 3 to 6 months of my uncle's cabin being occupied by someone who had no right to be there. 3 to 6 months of Karen telling anyone who would listen that I was the bad guy trying to steal her inheritance. 3 to 6 months of watching my legal fees pile up while she sat on my property pretending it was hers. I told him to start the process. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and phone calls. I had to gather every document related to the cabin, the deed, the tax records, the will, the letters from Uncle Roy's doctors confirming his mental state. My lawyer filed the ejectment action, and Karen was served with papers at the cabin. She responded by filing a counterclaim alleging that Uncle Roy had promised her the property and that I had unduly influenced him to change his will. She claimed I had isolated him from the rest of the family and manipulated him into leaving me the cabin. That was when things got really ugly. Karen started posting about the situation on Facebook. She called me a greedy cousin who had stolen her dying uncle's property. She said I had taken advantage of an old man with dementia. She said I had ruined her family's chance at a better life. Her friends shared the posts. People I had not spoken to in years started sending me messages asking if the stories were true. I stopped answering my phone. Gary showed up at my job site one afternoon. He parked his truck across the street and just sat there watching me work. He did not say anything. He did not do anything. He just sat there for 3 hours, staring at me through the windshield. My foreman noticed and asked if I needed to call the police. I said no, but I was not sure that was true. I called my lawyer and told him about Gary. He said I should document everything and consider filing a harassment complaint if it continued. He also said that Karen's counterclaim was weak because Uncle Roy's will had been drafted years before his dementia diagnosis, and the lawyer who prepared it had documentation showing Uncle Roy was of sound mind when he signed it. That was the first good news I had received in weeks. My mom called me almost every night during that period. She was Karen's aunt, and the situation put her in a terrible position. She loved her niece, but she also knew the truth. I am not taking sides, she would say, and then she would spend an hour taking my side anyway. She told me Karen had always been entitled, even as a child. She told me Uncle Roy had complained to her once that Karen only showed up when she wanted something, usually money or a place to stay for the weekend. She told me to fight for the cabin and not let anyone make me feel guilty for defending what was mine. Hearing that from my own mother gave me more strength than she probably realized. My lawyer scheduled a deposition a few days later. I sat in a conference room in downtown Portland while Karen answered questions under oath. She stumbled through her story about the verbal agreement, changing details every time my lawyer pressed for specifics. First, the conversation happened at a barbecue. Then it was at Christmas dinner. Then it was during a phone call she could not quite pin down. Her lawyer kept objecting, but the damage was already done. The court reporter typed every contradiction into the official record. But Karen was not done. She had one more card to play. She filed a motion to delay the eviction hearing, claiming she needed more time to prepare her case. The judge granted her an extra 30 days. That meant I had to wait another month before I could even argue my side in front of a judge. 30 more days of Karen living in my cabin. 30 more days of her posting lies about me online. 30 more days of wondering if Gary was going to show up at my job site again. I started having trouble sleeping. I would lie awake at night thinking about the cabin, about Uncle Roy, about all the weekends I had spent there helping him fix the roof or split firewood or just sitting on the porch watching the lake. The cabin was the last physical connection I had to him, and someone was trying to take it away. Hunter, my best friend since we served together in the Guard, could see I was spiraling. He started dragging me to the gym after work, making me lift weights until I was too exhausted to think. He said the best way to win a legal battle was to stay healthy enough to enjoy the victory. He was right, but it was hard to see the victory when I was buried in legal fees and social media attacks, and the constant fear that Gary was going to escalate from staring to something worse. The day before the eviction hearing, my lawyer called with news. He had subpoenaed Karen's phone records as part of the discovery process. What he found was a goldmine of evidence. Turns out Karen had been planning this for months. She had text messages with Gary discussing their strategy, messages where she admitted she knew the cabin was not hers, but said she was going to fight for it anyway, because she deserved it more than I did. She had text messages with her sister saying she was going to make my life hell until I gave up. She had text messages with a real estate agent asking how much the cabin would sell for once she got ownership. The verbal agreement with Uncle Roy? She had never mentioned it to anyone until after the will was read. Not to her husband, not to her sister, not to the real estate agent she was planning to sell the cabin to. My lawyer said this was going to be an easy win. The hearing lasted about 2 hours. Karen showed up in a nice dress with a lawyer who looked like he had been practicing law for about 15 minutes. She tried to tell the story about the verbal agreement, but she kept tripping over her own words. The judge asked her why she had never mentioned this agreement before the will was read. She said she did not think she needed to. The judge asked her why she had text messages discussing how to manipulate the situation if she believed the cabin was rightfully hers. She said those messages were taken out of context. The judge asked her why she had contacted a real estate agent about selling the cabin before she had legal ownership. She did not have an answer. Her lawyer tried to argue that Uncle Roy's dementia meant he was not competent to write a will, but my lawyer produced medical records showing the will was drafted 3 years before the diagnosis, and follow-up evaluations confirmed his mental acuity at the time of signing. The judge ruled in my favor. Karen had 30 days to vacate the property and return the keys. She was also ordered to pay my legal fees and court costs. Karen cried in the hallway outside the courtroom. She said I had ruined her life. She said Uncle Roy would be ashamed of me. She said I was going to burn in hell for what I did to her family. I walked past her without saying a word. Gary was waiting by the elevator. He looked at me with those cold eyes and said this was not over. I told him it was exactly over, and if he showed up at my job site again, I would file a restraining order. He did not say anything else. He just stepped into the elevator and let the doors close. I was not there when the sheriff executed the eviction. My lawyer advised against it. He said my presence would only provoke more conflict and give Karen ammunition to play the victim. But Hunter went. He parked across the road and watched the whole thing. He told me later that Karen screamed at the deputies, that Gary had to be physically restrained when they started loading furniture onto the lawn, that the youngest kid was crying and asking why they had to leave. Hunter said it was the saddest thing he had ever seen, and also the most deserved. I felt guilty about that kid for weeks. I kept imagining him asking his mother why they could not stay in the cabin by the lake, and I kept wondering what lie she told him to explain it. But I also felt something else underneath the guilt. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when a wound stops bleeding and you finally get to see the scar it leaves behind. 30 days after the hearing, I drove back to the cabin with a new set of locks and a truck full of cleaning supplies. The gravel driveway was rutted from Karen's SUV going in and out. A plastic tricycle lay abandoned in the weeds near the porch. Karen had left the place in rough shape. There were food stains on the kitchen counters, cigarette burns on the porch railing, and a hole in the drywall where someone, probably Gary, had punched through to the studs. But none of that mattered, because the lake was still there. The trees were still there. The mountain air still smelled exactly the way I remembered it, like pine needles and damp earth and freedom. I spent the weekend cleaning and fixing and remembering why I love this place. I replaced the deadbolt with a smart lock that sent notifications to my phone. I installed security cameras. I built a new porch railing out of cedar that matched the original. And every time I drove a nail into wood, I felt a little more of the weight lift off my shoulders. On Sunday evening, I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the sun drop behind the trees on the far side of the lake. The water turned orange and gold, and then deep blue as the light faded. I sat there until the stars came out, and I felt something I had not felt in months. Peace.
Mike still lives in Portland and drives out to the cabin most weekends. He has not had any more trouble with Karen or Gary, though he keeps the security cameras running just in case. Karen moved to Washington State a few months after the eviction. She never paid the legal fees the court ordered, and Mike decided it was not worth chasing her. The legal battle cost him nearly $8,000, but he will tell you it was money well spent. The cabin is not just a piece of property to him. It is a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means fighting for it. It is a reminder that family can be the people who hurt you most, but that does not mean you have to let them. And it is a reminder that Uncle Roy, who spent his last years surrounded by people who only wanted what he could give them, trusted Mike to take care of the one place that mattered to him. Mike does not talk about the battle much. He does not post about it online or bring it up at family gatherings. He just shows up at the cabin, turns on the porch light, and lives his life the way Uncle Roy would have wanted him to. Quietly. Peacefully. Alone with the lake and the trees and the memories of a man who knew exactly who loved him and who did not.